The sun was dipping low over Biltmore village when the smell of baked lasagna filled the Whitaker house. Helen moved slowly between the counter and the oven, her hands practiced, careful. For years, Sunday dinners had been a family ritual, her small way of keeping everyone together. She'd made Ryan's favorite meal, the one he used to beg for when he was a boy. The table was set neatly, with her mother's old china and linen napkins, folded the way Ryan liked them. But the warmth that once filled the house had long gone cold. Tina arrived first, the sound of her heels sharp against the wooden floor. She looked around, unimpressed, then said, "Still using the same old plates, Helen? You really should update things." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. She sat down, crossed her legs, and began scrolling on her phone. Helen said nothing. She'd learned silence was safer. When Ryan finally came in, the door slammed against the wall. He tossed his keys on the table, the clatter echoing through the kitchen. "You couldn't fix that door hinge," he muttered, dropping onto a chair. Helen turned from the stove, wiping her hands on her apron. "I was going to call the handyman this week," she said softly. "You were going to," he repeated, his tone dripping with irritation. "Just like you were going to pay the water bill, or going to stop leaving lights on all day." Tina smirked behind her wine glass. Helen took a breath, forcing a calm she didn't feel. "I did pay the bills, Ryan. The house is still in my name. I take care of it." That last sentence, unplanned, quiet, hung in the air like a spark in dry grass. Ryan's head snapped up. "What did you just say?" "I said the house. This house," he interrupted, standing so fast the chair screeched against the floor, "is mine. I've been the one paying for everything. You just live here because I let you." Tina leaned back, watching as if it were a show she'd seen before. Her lips curved into something cruel. Helen's heart pounded, but her voice stayed steady. "Ryan, please. You don't mean that." He stepped closer, the smell of whiskey on his breath. "Don't tell me what I mean, Mother." When she didn't answer, he gripped her chin, forcing her to meet his eyes. "You never listen. You never stop talking. You act like this is still your house, like you still run things." Then came the first slap, sharp, ringing, and then another, and another. 15 in all, each one harder, more desperate than the last. Helen didn't scream. She didn't raise her hands to defend herself. She just stood there, eyes locked on the man who had once held her finger when he learned to walk. When it was over, Ryan stepped back, breathing hard. Tina finished her wine and said lightly, "You should go lie down, Helen. You look awful." Helen straightened her back, her cheek red and swollen, and whispered, "So do you." Then she turned away, quietly clearing the dishes from the table, her hands trembling only once. The son she had raised was gone, and in his place stood a stranger she would never know again. That night, the house felt colder than it ever had. Helen stood in the small bedroom she had moved into years ago after Ryan and Tina claimed the master suite for themselves. The faint yellow light from the bedside lamp revealed the damage on her face, a map of bruises spreading across pale skin. Her reflection in the old mirror looked like someone else's life, someone she pitied but no longer recognized. For a long moment, she just stared, tracing the outline of the swelling along her cheekbone. The skin burned when she touched it, but the pain felt distant, muted, like her body was no longer her own. She remembered the last time she had stood in that very spot crying, the night her husband, Robert, passed away. Back then, the house had been full of people and flowers and casseroles from neighbors who meant well. Now it was full of silence and resentment. Her gaze shifted toward the dresser. The top drawer stuck a little, as it always did before sliding open. Inside were the papers she hadn't touched in years, the property deed, bank documents, and a faded photograph of Ryan at age 5, covered in mud and smiling with missing teeth. She picked it up, studied it. then placed it face down on the table. Robert had bought this house with his savings from the hardware store he'd built from nothing. When he died, he'd left it entirely in Helen's name. Ryan had promised to handle the paperwork, said it would be smarter to transfer the title to his name to save on taxes. But somehow it had never been finalized. Now, that unfinished paperwork was her only lifeline. Helen pulled out the folder, checked each document carefully, and laid them neatly across the table. The legal descriptions, the notarized pages, her husband's signature, still hers, still valid. She sat down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. There were no tears left. The humiliation had burned them dry. All that remained was a stillness, the kind that comes after a storm, quiet, heavy, and absolute. From the living room came laughter, Tina's high, nasal giggle and Ryan's voice following it, low and slurred. They were watching television, maybe drinking wine. As if nothing had happened, the sound crawled up the hallway, filling the room like smoke. Helen closed the folder and placed it inside her leather handbag. Then she switched off the lamp. Standing by the window, she looked out at the street below, the soft glow of the streetlight on the wet pavement. Her heart no longer raced. Her decision was clear, calm, and final. If she stayed, she would disappear, slowly, quietly, until nothing was left of the woman she once was. But if she left, she might still have a chance to live. In the reflection of the darkened glass, the bruised woman met her own eyes. For the first time in years, Helen didn't look afraid. She looked awake. The morning light crept slowly across the quiet street as Helen slipped out of the house. Ryan's car was gone, and Tina's perfume still lingered faintly in the hallway. She moved carefully, holding her purse close, her steps deliberate and silent. The bruises on her face were fading from purple to yellow, but the ache in her chest hadn't lessened. She didn't look back when she locked the door behind her. The air outside was crisp and cool, the kind that smelled faintly of rain and pine. Helen walked to the bus stop at the corner, her old leather bag heavy with documents. The ride to downtown Asheville felt longer than usual. Each stop seemed to echo her heartbeat, each mile a small act of defiance. When she reached the old brick building that used to house Grayson and Myers Legal, she hesitated. The gold letters on the glass door were faded, and only one name remained. Samuel Grayson, Esq. He'd been Robert's closest friend, the man who had drafted their first mortgage contract nearly 40 years ago. Samuel looked up from a pile of papers when she entered. His hair was whiter now, his glasses perched low on his nose. For a second, he didn't recognize her. Then his face changed, shock, then anger, then something softer. "Good Lord, Helen, what happened to you?" She forced a small smile. "Life," she said simply. He gestured for her to sit. "Does Ryan know you're here?" "No," she replied, "and I'd prefer to keep it that way." Samuel studied her carefully. She pulled a folder from her bag and slid it across the desk. "I want to sell the house," she said. He opened it, scanning the documents. His eyebrows rose. "Helen, this property deed is still under your name. The transfer your son mentioned was never notarized. He couldn't sell it even if he tried." Helen's lips curved slightly, but it wasn't a smile. "I thought so." Samuel leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. "Are you sure you want to do this? It's your family home. And Ryan, he's still your son." Helen met his eyes, her voice calm and even. "No, Samuel. That man who lives there now, he's not my son. My son disappeared the night he raised his hand against me." The old lawyer exhaled heavily, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Then we'll do this properly," he said at last, quietly and quickly. He picked up the phone, making a few calls to an old real estate contact, to a notary he trusted, to the county registry office. Helen sat silently, watching him move with the same precision she remembered from years ago. By noon, the plan was in motion. The house would be appraised, listed discreetly, and the paperwork prepared for immediate transfer. When Samuel hung up, he looked at her again. By this evening, it'll be done. Helen stood, her spine straight, her voice steady. Thank you, Samuel. You just helped me do something I should have done years ago. As she stepped back into the sunlight, a strange calm settled over her. The bruises still marked her skin, but beneath them, something new was forming. Resolve. The next afternoon, the office smelled faintly of old paper and coffee as Helen sat across from Samuel, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The notary, a woman with sharp eyes and a calm voice, slid the final page of the contract across the table. The names Helen Whitaker and the Andersons were printed in clean black ink. The Andersons were a kind couple in their 50s who had recently moved from Virginia. They spoke softly, complimenting the garden and the warmth of the house. Helen nodded, smiling politely, though her chest ached with every word. That house had been her whole life. Robert's laughter, Ryan's first steps, the Christmas mornings filled with wrapping paper and cocoa. Now all of it was being signed away. Just here, the notary said gently, tapping her pen on the page. Helen's hand trembled as she lifted the pen. For a brief moment she paused, seeing Robert's signature faintly through the copy beneath. Then she pressed the pen down and wrote her name with careful strokes. The moment the ink touched the paper, she felt something shift inside her, an invisible weight, long carried, lifting from her shoulders. It wasn't regret. It was release. Samuel collected the documents and handed one copy to her. Everything's done, he said softly. By tonight, it'll be recorded at the county registry. Helen nodded. Thank you. Samuel. He hesitated. You're sure you'll be all right? She looked up, her eyes clear and steady. For the first time in years, I think I will. Outside, the autumn air was cool and damp. Helen walked down the sidewalk toward the bank. She deposited the check, every last cent, into an account Ryan didn't know existed. The teller, an older woman with silver hair, smiled warmly at her, unaware of what this quiet transaction meant. When she stepped back into the street, a breeze lifted her hair, carrying the smell of rain. She adjusted the strap of her bag, now lighter than it had ever been. Inside were only the essentials, her ID, the deed copies, a few photographs, and just enough clothes for a few days. At the Greyhound terminal, the sky was a deep gray, clouds rolling in from the mountains. She bought a one-way ticket to Hendersonville, no luggage, no forwarding address. While she waited, her phone buzzed again and again. Ryan. Then Tina. Then both. She didn't answer. The first message flashed on the screen. Where are you? We need to talk. Then another. You can't just leave. This is crazy. Helen watched the phone vibrate one last time before she pressed and held the power button. The screen went black. When the bus arrived, she climbed aboard, finding a seat by the window. As the vehicle pulled away from Asheville, raindrops streaked across the glass, distorting the familiar skyline. Each mile that passed blurred the edges of her old life a little more. By the time the city lights disappeared behind the trees, the rain had turned into a steady, cleansing drizzle. Helen closed her eyes. The rhythmic sound of wheels on wet pavement carrying her into a silence she'd been waiting for her whole life. Clara Moore's small house sat at the edge of Hendersonville, framed by dogwood trees and a porch that smelled faintly of lemon oil and old books. When Helen knocked, the door opened almost immediately. Clara stood there in her cardigan and slippers, her gray hair pinned back, her eyes widening at the sight of her friend. "Oh, Helen!" she whispered, her voice trembling. Then she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around her. "Come in, sweetheart. You're safe now." Helen stayed in the small guest room off the living room. It had lace curtains and a quilt that smelled of lavender. That first night, she slept for nearly 12 hours. Her body felt heavy, but her mind, after so many sleepless nights, finally went quiet. In the mornings, they sat together on the porch swing with cups of chamomile tea, watching the mist rise from the mountains. For a while, neither said much. The silence was comfortable, the kind that needed no explanation. But one afternoon, as the light turned soft and golden, Clara finally asked the question that had been sitting on her tongue. "What happened, Helen? What did he do to you?" Helen stared at her cup. The steam curled upward like a ghost. "He hit me," she said simply. 15 times. Clara's breath caught. "Ryan." Helen nodded. "He used to be a kind boy, thoughtful, gentle, but I loved him too much. I made him weak." They sat in silence after that, the cicadas humming in the trees. Clara reached over and took her hand, squeezing gently. "You didn't make him weak," she said. "He made his own choices." That night, Helen woke suddenly, her heart racing. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. She reached for her cheek, the skin smooth now beneath her fingers, as if to make sure it had really happened. Then she exhaled, realizing she was safe. Days passed quietly. Helen began helping Clara in her garden, pulling weeds, watering flowers. She spoke little, choosing instead to listen. The sound of wind in the trees, the call of a train in the distance, her own breath steadying. The bruises on her face began to fade, but something deeper inside her was still raw, still tender. She knew healing would take time. And for the first time in years, Helen wasn't afraid of time. She had stopped running from silence. Now, she was learning to live inside it. It was Clara who first suggested that Helen find a place of her own. "You can't heal in a borrowed space," she said one morning, handing her a folded newspaper with real estate listings circled in blue ink. "You need somewhere that belongs only to you." Helen hesitated at first. The idea of owning another home so soon after selling the last one felt strange, like reopening a wound before it had time to scar. But a week later, as they drove along the Blue Ridge Parkway, something shifted. The rolling mountains stretched endlessly, the trees turning the first shades of autumn gold. When they passed a weathered wooden sign that read "For sale small orchard and cottage" near Brevard, Clara slowed the car. The property sat at the end of a gravel road, hidden behind apple trees heavy with fruit. A narrow creek ran beside the house, its water clear and soft-sounding against the rocks. The cottage itself was old, peeling paint, leaning porch rails, but it had a warmth Helen hadn't felt in years. Inside, the wooden floors creaked under her feet. The kitchen smelled faintly of cedar. Through the back window, she could see a field of wildflowers brushing against the fence. It wasn't grand or new or even perfectly intact, but it was hers the moment she saw it. She bought it within the week, using only part of the money from the sale in Asheville. Samuel helped with the paperwork, making sure everything was legally sealed and recorded under her name alone. The first days were quiet and full. Helen spent her mornings planting small vegetable beds and fixing the broken gate. She hung curtains, arranged wildflowers in jars, and set a rocking chair on the porch. Each evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, she listened to the creek and felt something she hadn't in a long time. Peace that didn't depend on anyone else. But peace, she would learn, rarely stays untested. One morning, as fog rolled low across the orchard, Helen heard the crunch of gravel outside. When she opened the door, Ryan stood there. His clothes were wrinkled, his eyes sunken, his hands trembling slightly. "Mom," he began, voice hoarse. I've been looking for you. I am sorry. I lost everything. Tina left. I don't know what to do." Helen didn't move. The smell of stale whiskey drifted from his jacket. "You should get help," she said quietly. He stepped forward, desperate. "Let me stay here, just until I get back on my feet. Please, Mom." Her voice was calm, even gentle. "You're not my son," she said. "My son died the night he hit me." Ryan's face twisted in disbelief. You can't mean that. I'll take you to court if I have to. That house, this house, Helen interrupted softly, isn't yours. And the last one never was. He froze, realizing she wasn't bluffing. Samuel had made sure every document was airtight. Ryan's shoulders sagged. Without another word, he turned and walked down the gravel drive, his figure fading into the mist. Helen watched until he disappeared, then closed the door slowly. The morning air slipped through the cracks of the old house, carrying with it the scent of apple blossoms. Her heart felt lighter, fragile, yes, but free, like the first leaf loosened by autumn wind. The days began to settle into rhythm, as if the orchard itself was teaching Helen how to breathe again. Each morning, she woke with the first light, her hair still smelling faintly of apples. She'd step out onto the porch barefoot, the dew cold against her skin, and listen to the quiet hum of the countryside. Then she'd pick a few apples from the lowest branches, brew her coffee, and sit at the old pine table to write in her journal. At first, her handwriting trembled, uneven and uncertain like her thoughts, but soon the words began to flow, memories, small victories, and questions she didn't need answered. Writing became her confession, her prayer, her proof that she still existed. By the second week, she had neighbors. The Fernandez couple from the next property over appeared one afternoon, carrying a warm apple pie wrapped in a checkered towel. "Welcome to the neighborhood," Mrs. Fernandez said with a smile so wide it reached her eyes. Helen invited them in, poured coffee, and listened as they spoke about their grandchildren, the harvest, and how the deer always ate the tomatoes before they ripened. When Mrs. Fernandez finally asked, "So what brought you here, Helen?" she answered simply, "A need for quiet." And that was enough. She started to smile more. Small, soft smiles at the sound of birds, at the smell of cinnamon, at the creak of her rocking chair on the porch. She learned to fix fences and mend curtains, her hands steady and sure. Still, some habits were slower to fade. Whenever she heard the distant rumble of an approaching car, her chest tightened. She'd pause, waiting, half expecting to see Ryan's silhouette appear through the mist. But the cars always passed, and she would exhale, whispering to herself, "Not today." Then, one afternoon, the phone rang. It was Samuel. His voice carried the familiar steadiness she had come to rely on. "I thought you should know," he said. "Ryan's left Asheville. He moved to Tennessee. Tina's gone, no one's sure where." Helen didn't speak right away. She looked out through the kitchen window where the sunlight fell across the apple trees. The breeze was soft, almost warm. "I see," she said finally. "Are you all right?" Samuel asked. A small smile touched her lips. "Yes, finally. I think I can breathe." When she hung up, Helen stepped outside. The sky was turning pink behind the mountains. She stood there for a long time, her eyes closed, the scent of apples and rain wrapping around her like a quiet blessing. It was Clara who thought Helen might need something more than solitude. "You've rebuilt your life," she said one afternoon over tea, "but maybe it's time to share what you've learned." She handed Helen a brochure for the Willow House Shelter, a local center in Asheville for women escaping abusive homes. The next week, Helen took the bus into town and met Laura Patterson, the shelter's director, a woman in her early 50s with gentle eyes and the kind of calm that made others exhale. Laura welcomed her with a warm handshake. "Clara speaks very highly of you," she said. "We always need volunteers who understand, not from pity, but from experience." The shelter was a large white house with green shutters and a wraparound porch. Inside, the air smelled of soap, coffee, and something faintly floral. Children's drawings covered the walls. The rooms were small, but filled with life. Helen started helping in the kitchen twice a week, cooking breakfast for the residents, simple meals of eggs, toast, and oatmeal. At first, she kept to herself, focusing on the rhythm of cooking. But over time, women began to talk to her. One young mother told her about fleeing in the middle of the night with only her daughter's backpack. Another woman described the guilt that kept her returning to the man who hurt her. Helen listened quietly, offering neither advice nor judgment, only presence. "You're easy to talk to," one of them said once, eyes red from crying. Helen smiled softly. "Maybe because I've been where you are," she replied. As the weeks passed, she found herself spending more time there, helping organize donations, folding laundry, reading bedtime stories to children who couldn't sleep. It wasn't work. It was healing, disguised as service. One afternoon, Laura stopped by the kitchen holding a small beige envelope. "This came for you," she said. Inside was a handwritten note from one of the residents who had recently left the shelter. "Dear Helen, you probably don't remember me. You gave me tea and told me I wasn't broken. That night, I decided not to go back to him. You saved me without even knowing it." Helen's hands trembled slightly as she folded the letter back into the envelope. For the first time in a long while, tears welled in her eyes, but they weren't from pain. They were from recognition. That evening, she sat at her kitchen table in Brevard, the letter beside her, and opened a blank notebook. She began to write, not a diary this time, but a story. Her story. It wasn't for revenge or closure. It was for every woman who had once felt small, afraid, or invisible. Months later, the manuscript was complete. On the cover, in simple black letters, it read, starting over at 60, Helen touched the title with her fingertips, smiling to herself. For the first time, her past no longer felt like a wound. It felt like purpose. 6 months later, the first printed copies of Starting Over at 60 arrived from the small press in Asheville. Helen held the book carefully, running her fingers over the matte cover. The title was simple, the photograph on the front, an empty chair under an apple tree, quiet and unassuming. It was exactly how she wanted it, honest without ornament. The launch took place at Old Town Books, a cozy, time-worn shop tucked between a cafe and a flower store on Lexington Avenue. The owner had set up folding chairs and a small table near the window. A vase of daisies sat beside a neat stack of her books. Clara and Laura were there, sitting in the front row, beaming with pride. Helen wasn't nervous. Instead, she felt a strange stillness inside her, as if everything that needed to be said had already been written. She read a few passages aloud, her voice steady, clear. The audience listened quietly, nodding, some wiping tears from their eyes. When she finished, there was a moment of silence before the applause began, and then she saw him. Near the back of the room, half in shadow, stood Ryan. His shoulders were slumped, his face thinner, older than she remembered. He held a copy of her book in his hands, unopened. Their eyes met for a brief second before he looked away. After the signing, as the crowd dispersed and the chatter softened, Ryan approached the table. Helen didn't move. She waited, calm, collected, her pen still resting between her fingers. "Mom," he said quietly. His voice cracked slightly on the word. "I read it." Helen looked up at him. "Then you already know everything I could say." He nodded, reaching into his jacket pocket. He placed a white envelope on the table. "This is for you. It's the money I owe. For the house. For everything." Helen didn't touch it. "I don't need it, Ryan." "I need to give it," he said, his eyes tired but sincere. She studied him for a long moment. The man standing before her wasn't the one who had hit her. There was something different now. Remorse, perhaps, or exhaustion deep enough to make honesty possible. "If you really want to make it right," she said softly, "donate it to the Willow House. Help someone else get the chance you wasted." He hesitated, then nodded. "I will." They stood there in silence, the hum of the bookstore filling the space between them. No hugs, no apologies that could fix the past, just acknowledgement. As Ryan turned to leave, he paused at the door and looked back. Thank you for not hating me. Helen's eyes softened. Hatred's too heavy, she said. I had to put it down. He gave a small nod, then walked out into the gray Asheville evening. For the first time, he didn't slam the door behind him. He closed it gently. Helen exhaled, watching the rain begin to fall outside. Then she picked up her pen and signed one last copy of her book, with hands that no longer trembled. Word of Helen's book began to travel further than she ever expected. It started with a short article in the Asheville Gazette, then a radio segment about local authors making a difference. Soon after, the mailbox at her orchard began filling with letters, each one written in a different hand, but all carrying the same heartbeat of recognition. Women from across the state, some widows, some grandmothers, some still living quietly under the weight of fear, wrote to thank her. They said her words made them feel seen, made them believe it wasn't too late to begin again. One letter, written in neat cursive on line stationery, caught her attention. It was signed Dorothy Briggs, age 72. Dorothy's story was painfully familiar. An only son who had grown cruel, who'd taken over her property after her husband's death and left her with nothing but guilt and confusion. I don't know where to start, the letter read, but if you could do it at 60, maybe I can at 72. Helen folded the page carefully and called Laura at the Willow House. The next week, she met Dorothy there. Dorothy was small and frail, her hands trembling as she clutched her purse, but her eyes carried a quiet fire. They sat together in the same kitchen where Helen had once served oatmeal and tea to other women. I thought I was the only one, Dorothy said, her voice shaking. You're not, Helen replied gently. You never were. They talked for hours. By the time the afternoon light faded, Helen had already called Samuel. He agreed to meet Dorothy, review her documents, and help her reclaim what was rightfully hers. When Dorothy realized she wouldn't have to face it alone, she began to cry, not from sorrow, but from sheer relief. If you could start over at 60, she whispered, gripping Helen's hands tightly, then I can too. Helen smiled softly. Yes, you can. And maybe someday, you'll help the next woman believe the same. That evening, as Helen walked home from the shelter, the air smelled of rain and wood smoke. The streets shimmered under the glow of streetlights, and she felt something stir within her. An understanding that what she had done wasn't just survival. It was legacy, revenge. She realized had never been about taking back what was lost. It was about helping others rise from what tried to break them. And as the first drops of rain fell on her coat, Helen knew the ripple she had started would go on long after she was gone. Winter melted softly into spring, and with it came something new, a sense of community that seemed to grow from the same soil Helen had once tended alone. With Laura's encouragement, she started a small weekly gathering at the shelter, a space where women from the nearby mountain towns could meet, talk, and heal together. They called it Starting Together. The meetings were simple. No formal agenda, no rules, just chairs arranged in a loose circle, coffee brewing in the corner, and an unspoken promise that whatever was shared in that room would stay there. At first, only a handful came, but word spread quickly, and soon the circle expanded. Women of every age, divorcees, widows, mothers, even a few younger women just finding their voices, filled the little meeting room each week. They laughed, cried, traded recipes, and little by little began to trust again. Helen often sat quietly through most of it, her calm presence a kind of anchor. When she did speak, her words carried the weight of someone who had walked through fire and learned how to live with the scars. One evening, as the group discussed forgiveness, a young woman, barely in her 20s, lifted her hand timidly. Mrs. Whitaker, she said, do you forgive your son? The room fell silent. Helen looked down at her cup of tea, watching the thin curl of steam drift upward. I accept his remorse, she said finally, But forgiveness doesn't mean going back. I've learned to wish him well from where I stand. The young woman nodded slowly, her eyes shining with understanding. Later that week, Samuel stopped by the orchard. He looked older, but the warmth in his eyes hadn't changed. They sat on the porch, the sound of birds filling the quiet spaces between their words. "I thought you should know," Samuel said gently. "Ryan's doing better. He's been attending recovery meetings. He's helping with outreach programs in Tennessee. And last month, he spoke publicly about what he did. He apologized." Helen listened, her expression calm, her fingers tracing the rim of her mug. She didn't ask for details. She didn't need them. When Samuel finished, she smiled faintly. "That's good," she said. He studied her for a moment. "You're not angry?" She shook her head. "No. Anger was heavy. I left it behind." The late afternoon sun spilled across the porch, turning the orchard gold. Helen looked out toward the trees, her voice quiet but sure. "He knows I won't call, and I know he doesn't expect me to. Sometimes silence is the only forgiveness we can give." Samuel nodded. "And sometimes," he said softly, "it's the one that means the most." Helen smiled again, her gaze fixed on the apple blossoms swaying in the wind. The circle she had started of women of healing, of second chances, was still growing, and somewhere deep inside, she knew it would never end with her. 2 years passed quietly, the kind of passing that smooths out even the deepest wounds. Autumn had returned to Brevard, painting the orchard in copper and gold. The apples hung heavy on the branches again, and the air smelled of cinnamon and wood smoke. Helen decided it was time for a gathering, not a celebration, not exactly, but a circle of gratitude. She invited Clara, Laura, Dorothy, and the women from the Starting Together group. They came with casseroles and laughter, their coats rustling like dry leaves. The orchard shimmered under strings of soft lights, the long wooden table covered in pies and homemade bread. As twilight settled over the mountains, the women shared stories of new beginnings, of small victories, of the lives they had rebuilt. Clara teased that Helen's apples made the best pie in Henderson County, and someone joked that they should rename the group, starting over at 60 and beyond. Laughter rose, warm and bright against the cooling evening air. Helen moved among them easily, refilling cups, hugging shoulders, her heart full but calm. These women weren't just survivors anymore. They were friends, sisters in resilience. And she, once silent and afraid, had become something she never thought she'd be again, a center of strength. As the sun began to slip behind the ridge, painting the sky in soft amber light, the faint hum of an engine reached them. A car turned slowly into the gravel drive and stopped near the fence. The laughter faded. Helen turned. Ryan stepped out. He looked different, thinner still, but clearer somehow, as though the years had stripped away everything unnecessary. In his hands, he held a small wooden box. For a moment, he just stood there, eyes searching for hers across the fading light. Then he walked forward slowly. "I didn't want to interrupt," he said quietly. "I just came to give you this." He extended the box. Helen took it, fingers brushing his briefly. Inside, cushioned in soft fabric, was a delicate gold pocket watch. Her breath caught. Her mother's watch. The one she'd lost decades ago in the chaos of moving after Robert's death. "I found it," Ryan said. "It was in one of my old boxes from the attic in Asheville. I thought you'd want it back." He hesitated, eyes flickering between guilt and hope. "I know it doesn't change anything. I just wanted to say thank you for not hating me." For a moment, neither spoke. The sound of the creek and the whisper of the trees filled the silence. Helen ran her thumb over the smooth surface of the watch, feeling the tiny engravings her mother had once loved. Then she smiled, a soft, steady smile. "Thank you for finding it," she said. Ryan nodded. "Take care, Mom." He turned to go. Helen watched him walk toward the car, his steps slow but sure, the gravel crunching beneath his shoes. When he reached the end of the path, he looked back one last time, gave a small nod, and then drove away. No tears came, only peace. When the guests left later that night, Helen sat by the window, the old watch ticking softly in her palm. The second hand moved with calm precision, each beat steady, certain. Outside, the last light of day settled gently over the orchard, the trees swaying under the hush of evening. She smiled faintly, whispering to herself, "Justice doesn't always come with noise." The tick of the watch filled the quiet room, like a heartbeat in rhythm with the earth. Sometimes, she thought, it's the quiet peace that follows,